The heavy velvet curtains of my living room were drawn tight, sealing me inside a tomb of my own making, surrounded by the suffocating scent of expensive lilies and the hollow echo of a life that had suddenly gone silent. At 81, I look in the mirror and see a map of every war I ever lost and every empire I managed to build from the ashes. But 30 years ago, I was a woman paralyzed by the invisible weight of other people's expectations. I spent decades performing for an audience that wasn't even watching, convinced that my value was tied to the approval of neighbors, the smiles of distant relatives, and the nod of a society that didn't know my name. The realization hit me like a physical blow on a Tuesday afternoon when I lost my first fortune. I sat in my empty foyer waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the people I had supported to offer a hand, only to realize that the world keeps spinning regardless of your personal apocalypse. This was the birth of the most liberating and terrifying truth I would ever learn. Nobody cares about you, and in that cold indifference lies the ultimate freedom to finally care about yourself. I had spent 56 years being a secondary character in my own story, playing the role of the reliable daughter, the tireless worker, and the silent martyr, all while my own dreams gathered dust in the attic of my mind. We are taught from birth that we are the center of the universe, that every mistake we make is being cataloged by a judgmental public. But the reality is that everyone is too busy fighting their own demons to notice the cracks in your armor. When I finally understood that my failures were mine alone and my successes belonged to no one else, the fear that had kept me stagnant for 30 years evaporated, leaving behind a raw, unfiltered drive that I never knew I possessed. I had to lose everything, the house, the cars, the fake friends, and the false security, to realize that the only person who was ever going to save me was the woman staring back at me in the glass, and she was tired of waiting for permission to exist. This isn't a story about money, though millions were made and lost. It is a story about the moment I stopped asking for a seat at the table and decided to build my own house in the middle of the wilderness. Rebuilding a life at 63 is not the poetic journey of self-discovery that the movies portray. It is a gritty, bone-deep exhaustion that tests the very fiber of your soul, while the rest of the world suggests you should be fading quietly into the sunset of retirement. I remember standing in a tiny one-bedroom apartment with nothing but a folding chair and a suitcase, feeling the sting of every person who whispered that I was past my prime and that my best years were buried under the debt of my previous collapse. They told me I was crazy to try again, that I should accept the meager leftovers of my life and be grateful for the crumbs. But those voices were the same ones that had kept me stuck in a loop of mediocrity for 3 decades. The secret that no one tells you about being lazy is that it is almost never about a lack of energy and almost always about a paralyzing fear of being seen trying and failing. Yet when you finally accept that people are too self-absorbed to truly judge you, the shackles of laziness simply fall away. I started again with a small catering business, working 18-hour days until my joints throbbed and my eyes burned, fueled not by a desire for luxury, but by the intoxicating realization that I owed no one an explanation for my ambition. I learned that the people who love you most are often the ones who hold you back the tightest, not out of malice, but because they are terrified that your growth will highlight their own stagnation or change the dynamic they have grown comfortable with. My own family begged me to play it safe, to take a steady job, to stop embarrassing myself by starting over at an age when most people are slowing down. But I had finally learned to distinguish between their fear and my reality. Every time I felt like quitting, I reminded myself that the one piece of advice that kept me stuck for 30 years was the lie that I had to wait for the perfect timing and the perfect support system before I could move. I realized that the perfect time is a myth designed to keep the dreamers in their place, and that the only support system that matters is the iron will inside your own chest that refuses to let the fire go out. The second million didn't feel like the first. The first was a desperate attempt to prove my worth to others, but the second was a quiet declaration of war against the limitations I had once accepted as gospel. By 65, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving in a way that confused everyone who had written me off as a relic of the past, proving that the shelf life of a human being is determined by their spirit rather than their birth certificate. I began to look at money differently, not as a scorecard for my ego, but as a tool for autonomy, a way to ensure that I would never again have to bow my head to someone else's definition of what a woman my age should be. The most painful part of this ascent was watching the circle of people around me shrink, as those who were comfortable with my failure found themselves increasingly threatened by my resurrection and my refusal to play the victim. I had to learn the hard way that you cannot take everyone with you to the top, especially those who are determined to stay in the valley of excuses, blaming the economy, their upbringing, or their luck for things they have the power to change. I spent thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours trying to fix the people I loved, thinking that if I succeeded, they would see the light and follow. But I only ended up drained and distracted from my own purpose. It was during this period that I truly understood the nobody cares philosophy. It applies to your successes just as much as your failures, meaning you shouldn't expect a parade for doing what you were born to do. People will cheer for you when it's convenient and criticize you when it makes them feel better about themselves, but neither the praise nor the blame should be allowed to touch the core of who you are. I became a ghost to my old life, shedding the skin of the woman who needed validation like a drug, and instead I became addicted to the sound of my own footsteps moving forward into the unknown. When you reach your 70s with more wealth than you ever dreamed of and more scars than you care to count, you begin to see the world through a lens of brutal clarity that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. I saw young people paralyzed by social media, terrified of a digital audience that doesn't actually exist, repeating the same mistakes I made 30 years ago, but on a much larger and more public scale. They are obsessed with being liked by strangers while they ignore the dying embers of their own potential, forgetting that 1,000 digital hearts are worth nothing if you cannot look at yourself in the mirror without flinching. I started mentoring women who were stuck, and I saw the same haunting look in their eyes that I had in my 50s, that desperate search for a why when the answer was simply that they were waiting for someone to tell them they were allowed to be great. I told them the raw truth, that the world is a cold, indifferent machine that will consume your time and your talent without a second thought if you don't stand up and demand what is yours. We talked about the laziness trap, how it's actually a protective mechanism for the ego, because if you never truly try, you can always tell yourself that you could have been great if only you had wanted to. I watched them cry when I told them that their parents, their partners, and their friends were the primary obstacles to their success, not because those people were evil, but because they were keepers of the status quo. To break free, you have to be willing to be the villain in someone else's story, the selfish one who decided that their own mission was more important than maintaining the comfort of the people around them. I realized that my 30-year delay was a gift of perspective, allowing me to speak with a weight of authority that a younger version of me would have been too timid to claim. Now at 81, the urgency of time has become my most honest companion, a ticking clock that strips away the fluff and leaves only the essential truths that I am desperate to share before the silence takes me. I look at my hands, spotted with age and lined with the history of 1,000 battles, And I realized that the most expensive thing I ever owned was the time I wasted worrying about what people thought of me. Every day I wake up and see the views climbing on my videos, the comments from people halfway across the world, and I feel a strange sense of irony that I became famous only after I stopped caring if anyone knew my name. The wealth mindset isn't about hoarding gold or buying mansions. It is about the unwavering belief that you are the architect of your reality and that no external force has the power to define your worth unless you hand them the pen. I have seen millionaires who are beggars in spirit, clutching their bank accounts out of fear, and I have seen people with nothing who carry themselves like royalty because they have mastered the art of self-approval. My advice to anyone listening is to stop looking for a mentor, a sign from the universe, or a perfect moment, and instead embrace the terrifying reality that you are completely alone in your journey. This realization is the key to the cage. Once you accept that no one is coming to save you, you stop waiting and start walking, even if you have to walk through fire to get to where you belong. I am running out of time, but I am not running out of fire, and I refuse to leave this earth until I have convinced at least one soul to stop living for the ghosts of other people's opinions. The tragedy of life isn't that it ends too soon, but that we wait so long to begin it, held back by the illusion that we are being watched by a world that is actually looking the other way. As I sit here in the twilight of my years, reflecting on the millions made, the heartbreaks endured, and the sheer audacity of my second act, I am filled with a profound sense of peace that only comes from total self-honesty. I think back to the woman I was 30 years ago, huddled in fear, and I wish I could reach back through time and shake her, telling her that the one piece of advice she was following, to be patient and wait for her turn, was a slow-acting poison. Her turn was whenever she decided it was, and the only thing stopping her was the imaginary wall of societal judgment that she had helped build with her own insecurities. To the young and the old alike, I say this: let them judge you, let them misunderstand you, and let them talk behind your back, because their words have no power over a heart that has found its own rhythm. Your life is a fleeting spark in the darkness of eternity, too brief to be spent as a footnote in someone else's biography, and too precious to be traded for the safety of the herd. When people ask me how I rebuilt my life at 63, I tell them I simply stopped carrying the luggage of other people's expectations and realized that the lightest way to travel is to leave the past where it belongs. I am Dericia, a woman who lived twice because she died once to the opinions of others, and my final act is to be the voice that tells you what you are too afraid to tell yourself. You are not lazy, you are not incapable, and you are certainly not finished. You are simply waiting for a permission slip that was never going to come from anyone but you. So, take the leap, fail loudly, succeed unapologetically, and remember that when the dust settles, the only opinion that will echo in the silence of your soul is your own. The world doesn't care, and thank God for that, because now you can finally do exactly what you were meant to do without the burden of being watched.